So it's now time to move on to a new section. Previously, we looked at the transfer section of the documentation and we covered off a lot of Moralis functionality. But now we're going to be moving over to the WEB3 API. So let's head on over to the documentation. We'll click on documentation, and once that loads up, down the left-hand side, let's go to WEB3 API, token balances NFTs. Now, Moralis Web3 API is very, very fast, very, very powerful, and you can connect to it in multiple ways. For example, you can use the standard SDK, so you can install it directly into your application and just call the commands directly. Or if you've built your own infrastructure, then you can just hook into the actual API endpoints directly and go in that way yourself. So for example, if we go to Moralis and then let's just log in and just put in your server login details here. And once you get over to the dashboard or to the logged in section, on the left-hand side, you'll have the Web3 API over here. And you'll see all the different endpoints that you'll have available that are categorized into native, account, resolve, DeFi, and the new one here, which is storage. And in there, you'll be able to get some more information about how they work and what information you would need. So for example, in the curly brackets, you can pass in arguments or parameters to the endpoint to get back different results. And this would be the example of the block endpoint. You've got date to block, all these different ones we'll go through one by one in just a moment. So there's a couple of different ways that you could interact with your API. And of course, this is compatible with all different types of languages. So you could do this using JavaScript, or you could use using Python, or whichever other language you want to build your application in. We're going to start off by looking at using the SDK version of the Web3 API. So that's directly inside the JavaScript. Once we've installed it, we're going to be using functions in vanilla JavaScript. And then we'll come back and take a look at how to use those in React as well. For the rest of the page, we've already covered, but these are the 4 categories of the endpoints that we're going to be covering as we go forward. So let's jump into native first of all. The first one that we're going to look at will be get block, but you'll see down the right hand side that there's a number of different endpoints that are available here under the native section. And it'll be the same for account, token, and resolve, and the other ones as well. But what we'll find is that whilst I'll show you how to call these functions and what the information does and what these different parameters or arguments do and how they affect the outcome of the call, I also want to try and incorporate this into a live application that you'll be able to use as well. Now, the scope of this course is to talk to you about Moralis and show you how to use the Moralis functionality. It's not how to create an application using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So this is an example of an application that will use the Web3 API, but I'm not going to talk in great detail about how to build this application. I'll just provide you with the code and I'll walk you through function by function rather than build it line by line like some other tutorials that we have. So as an example, we have over here on the native section of the Web3 API, get block as our first endpoint. And we can call this particular function with one line of code by awaiting moralis.web3 api.native.getBlock and pass it some options. And this particular endpoint, this particular function has 2 options that you can pass it. You can pass the chain and you can pass the block number or the hash. What it will do is it will retrieve the contents of a block by the block hash. So what does that mean? Well, it will literally provide you with data like this for a specific block in time. So you can almost go back and retrieve a snapshot of the information at a particular time. And it will provide you with additional information as well, such as the difficulty, the gas used, and all of these different output items as well. Let's see how we would build this into a simple application in that case then. We'll go over to our Visual Studio Code. And for the purpose of the Web3 API native section, I've just built a Web3 API native HTML file. Inside that, I've got all the HTML and JavaScript that's needed to run this single page. Let's just load that up. And this just gives you some basic ideas of how you might use the functions in the API. So for example, get block data, just retrieve the contents of the block as we've said. So let's just choose a chain. We could use a simple select box for that. We'll choose Rinkeby, let's say, and we'll choose a block of say 100,000, whatever it might be. Get block data. And this particular function just dumps that information onto the screen so we can see what it's got. And you can see quite a lot of information that will come back from it. There are no transactions in this particular example, but with yours it might be different. And then what you'd need to do, of course, is go and fetch that information because it will just post an object on the screen here, you'd want to handle that in your own way, perhaps running through it with a loop. But like we said, the front end side of things is outside of the scope of this. So we're not going to be talking through how you would handle the data, just simply how you would go and fetch it. So the getBlockData function, if we go and find that, we'll just do a search for getBlock. There it is. So it's just an asynchronous function. And in this particular example, what I've done is gone and collected information from the front end. And then I built an options object, which passes the chain from the front end and the block number hash from the front end as well. And then with that options object, you just pass it into the function. Await Moralis.web3.native.getBlock with options. And then from there, the rest of the code is just about handling it and then passing it into the front end. And you're just appending a simple div element to the front end content div, which is made empty every time the function is run. Super straightforward. So that's how you get the information from getBlock. Let's move on back over to the documentation. So that's getBlock. The next one that we have here is getDateToBlock. And the idea of this particular function is that if you pass in a date into your options object, it'll run the code and return you back a timestamp and a block. So you could even feed this function with the result of that one. So they would be almost chained together. Get into the habit of always passing through a chain. The default value is going to be ETH if you don't pass it anything. And the date is required. You'll need to pass it in any format that is accepted by Moment.js. So a typical date function or format, something like this, would be fine. So if you were on the front end of your site using something like a date picker, so for example, this one, getDateToBlock, if we were using a date or timestamp picker here, and let's say we chose that date, then you'll just need to make sure that your date function handles that and turns it into a date that's more useful. Alternatively, you could provide it with a timestamp as well. If we went, for example, and looked for Rinkeby for the 20th of October 2021, and it's going to return us with the timestamp, the block, and that would be the date. And we'll just take a quick look on the function for that one. getDateToBlock. Again, similar sort of thing we have here. The majority of the code is going to just be handling the HTML. My options object I've just spread across a couple of lines so it's easier to read, but obviously you could put that into one line if you wish. But the main one line of code is await Moralis.web3 API.native.getDateToBlock with the options object. And then everything else after that handles what we get back as a result. So in this example, all I did is I took the value from the date picker field on the front end and I just ran a new date and then got time, divided it by 1,000, turned it into a timestamp effectively so I could run it through the function. You might handle it a slightly different way, and as long as you get a result, it makes no difference. So we'll just go over to the API section as well, click on DateToBlock, click on try it out. You can choose Rinkeby, and in the date you could use milliseconds or a date string. So for example, on our app here, we had a timestamp that came through, so we could just make sure that that is going to return the same thing. Execute that, and there you go, there are the details. Okay. Now we probably won't demonstrate each one of these endpoints because they're exactly the same. You'll be able to figure those out quite easily once you've seen how it works on the SDK, but I just wanted to show you a couple to give you a feel for it. Okay, so that's getDateToBlock. Now we've got a new one here, which is getLogsByAddress. GetLogsByAddress simply retrieves the logs, and so you've got a number of different parameters that you can use here. It would be you're required to pass in the address, the smart contract address. You also have event topics that you can pass through here as well. And there are a few others, for example, the to block and the from block. So you can take a snapshot of a particular to and from point. You just need to provide in the block number of the beginning and end of the search or the filter. And you can do the same with the date as well. Once you've provided those parameters, you will then get an example result that will look something like this, which includes the data. You also have the block hash. You'll have the block timestamp on the block number as well, and the transaction hash too. So there's some additional information if you need it. You will require some information about the smart contract to use that particular function, however. Okay, get contract events. This particular function will require the ABI of the smart contract that you're looking to query. And what it will do is simply get the events in descending order based on the block number and return an object of the contract events. And so you can pass through the ABI, the smart contract address, and the topic of the event in a format similar to this. So you would put the ABI as an object, save it into a variable called ABI like this. Then you would build your options object with the chain, the address, the topic, and then the ABI variable. And then you pass that options object into Moralis's one line of code, await moralis.web3api.native.getContractEvents. And the example result that you'll get will look something like this. Now, you won't be able to copy this exact code and paste it into your browser because this has got a sort of a shortened address here. So you'd need to make sure that you would paste in a proper address. So these two functions, this get logs by address and get contract events, are all based around smart contracts. And as you'd already know, a smart contract is a piece of self-executable software that's autonomously activated once certain pre-imposed conditions written in code are met. And they're typically going to be used for swapping tokens, executing trades, withdrawing funds, depositing funds, adding liquidity, things like that. And that information can be emitted out onto the blockchain, and you'll be able to look into that information. So how do you do that? How do you actually find some of this information to use these contracts? Well, if you head on over to Etherscan, and once you've loaded up Etherscan, just do a search for a contract of some sort. So if I was to search for example, Yearn Finance, and just load that up, there's all kinds of information that you can look through on Etherscan about Yearn Finance. So if we went over to contract, for example, you can see all of the contract information that's down here. So we know that, for example, the decimals of Yearn Finance would be 18. We would know that the governance, for example, this would be the contract address here. So if we clicked into that, we could then go and get more information about that specific contract. And if you scroll to this contract tab here, you'll be able to take a look at the source code for that contract. And in there, you'd be able to find different events or whatever it might be that you want to have a look at. The contract ABI is available here, and you could use that if you wanted to in some of the searches. But for now, not going to run into that. I'll leave you to experiment with those and try and find some that suits the application that you're looking to build. So let's move down. And the next one that we're going to take a look at in the documentation will be get NFT transfers by block. If we go back to the documentation, it's this one here. And so that retrieves NFT transfers by the block number or by the block hash. Provides in two options. You put the chain and then obviously the block number or the hash. That is required, and if you don't add a chain, then it just defaults to ETH, and this is something that you would get back as an example result. So we go back over to our little application, bring up the console window, and we'll click the button which has been preloaded with the function here. We can see that we get 17 results back from the function that I've just called, which uses this block hash number on the Binance Smart Chain. And we've got 17 different results here that come back, and you can go into all of that information and find out more about that specifically for NFTs. And that is all there is to the get NFTs by block. So that could be super useful if you want to go and find information from a particular block regarding those NFTs. And if we scroll down to get transaction, this one again is another simple one, just two options that you can provide. The transaction hash is required. But the chain is optional, and if you don't pass in a chain, it defaults to ETH. This particular function simply gets the transaction by the transaction hash and returns a transaction object, which would look something like this. And again, there's quite a bit of information that might be included in this. Inside the logs of this particular output, you do actually get information about data and topic. So let's head on over to our application and see if we can get that working as well. And in there, let's just clear the console window. And I've preloaded this button to run this function. It would simply build an options object with the chain as Binance Smart Chain. It looks like we've just duplicated this from the previous one, but let's see if we get the same result. It looks like it's thinking about something, so we'll just wait for that. Oh, there we go. And it has returned a different response. So this is a different function. I think it's just the front end that's not correct. But if we just look at the output for this, we can see that we have new information. And by storing this output into a variable, you'll be able to call any of this information out and use it in your front-end application. So that is how to get the transaction data. Again, super straightforward. And the last function in this section, this native Web3 API section, is run contract function. And it does exactly what it says. It runs a given function of a contract ABI and returns read-only data. It's asynchronous. There's a few more options compared to some of the previous ones here. The chain is standard amongst all of these. This is a common thing that you're going to find. Function name is going to be the function name. How do you find that? Well, if you go over to, for example, where we were before on the Yearn Finance, the functions that you can see down here have a name next to that. So, for example, function sub, or function div, whatever it might be. Or if we go back, for example, where we were before, here we go, allowance, balance of, decimals, governance. These are the kinds of things that would also be available for you to use. So if we come back to the documentation, that's the function name. It's required. We also need the smart contract address, another requirement, and we need the contract or function ABI. And what's different about this one compared to the previous ones up here, get logs by address, for example, I think was talking about the ABI, or maybe it was the next one, sorry, contract events. Yes, this one here. What's different with the run contract function is that the ABI needs to be passed as an array. So just make sure you wrap it in an array, otherwise it won't work. But again, store it into a variable, put the array inside, put the ABI inside an array inside that variable, pass it in as an option, and then wrap the option in an object and put it through the function. Moralis.web3api.native.run contract function with the options object. The example result that you'll get will obviously depend on the function name that you're running. And this example result, it says string, then depends on what it is that it was trying to get from this information up here. But if we go to the front end of our application here, I'm going to be using, I think I've just copy and pasted the code from here, but I think I'm using a different one. So let's go to the code, run contract function. So that was the old one. The new one, okay, so I've got an ABI here. It's in an array. And we're going to be getting a decimals function. So that's going to return a number based on decimals, and it will be based on this contract address, which is on the Binance Smart Chain. We're going to be running the decimals function. So presumably it's going to provide a number like 6 or 12 or 18 or something like that. Go back to the front end. Run the contract function. Let's just clear the console. Run the contract function 18. Okay, there you go. So that just simply ran the function of decimals in this case and return the number. If you choose a different function to run, it will provide you with a different output, of course. So that's quite a simple run through of the native section of the Web3 API in the documentation. I've shown you how you can run all of the code that's in here and how you can go and find or fetch the information. I've shown you how you can convert some of those functions to front-end applications by utilizing, for example, selects and inputs, and going collecting that information from the front end and then running the function from the application. What you do with the data is obviously down to you, and that comes down to your ability to handle HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in your application. And this is just a basic vanilla tutorial for how to use the native section. I've also shown you how you can go and get the data from the endpoints, requiring the same information as I've just shown you from using our SDK version. So that's great. So that is the native section. In the next section, we'll go and take a look at accounts, and that's where we can start bringing it to life and we can start building an application like this. So this is just a simple web wallet that we've built using the Web3 API functionality. So for example, if we log in and authenticate, then on the left-hand side, we have a transaction section. So you could type in a chain, go and get your Ethereum address. If you want, you could put in a date range from and to. Let's go for October. And then you can go and get those transactions and it will simply fetch them and detail them on here. And there's options that you can link that off to Etherscan or however else you want to work with this, and all sorts of things you can do to play around with your data. It just sort of brings everything to life. So the hard work that Moralis does is gives you the data, but what you do with it for a great user experience comes down to your skill as a developer. Next thing we can do is look at the tokens and balances. So you have ERC20, the native token balances. We'll be looking at NFTs as well. We'll bring in all of that in. We'll then move on to, once we've completed the account section, we'll move on to the Web3 API token section. And in here, I've got a lot more information to share with you. There's a lot more functions in here. And so we'll go through all of those as well. Great. So join me in the documentation and let's move over to the account section.